The bright side of addiction is recovery, and recovery is an American way of life. If you are in recovery, know or love someone who is, or simply want to know a little bit more about the recovery process, or maybe you're a bit concerned about someone you know or love who harmfully uses alcohol or any other drug, this is the podcast for you as we carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery. And a reminder, you can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. Welcome to Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. It was 45 years ago this month that the landscape of addiction and recovery in the United States, and for that matter, around the world, changed forever. As Betty Ford, the courageous wife of former President Gerald R. Ford, embarked on a journey that dealt a major blow to the stigma long associated with alcoholism and drug addiction. That was back in 1978. And 30 years ago this past October, Mrs. Ford put her money and her heart where her love was, where her recovery was, opening the Betty Ford Center at Eisenhower Hospital in Rancho Mirage, California, which quickly became a benchmark in the treatment of addictive disease. And then in February 2014, just some 9 years ago, the Betty Ford Center merged with the Hazelden Treatment Program, one of the oldest and most well-respected treatment programs in America. As we look back at Mrs. Ford's legacy in the field of addiction, on what would have been her 45th year in recovery, I'm going to share an interview that I did with Mrs. Ford at her home in Rancho Mirage, California. I was doing a cover story for Alcoholism Addiction Magazine, of which I was the editor. Mrs. Ford passed away at the age of 93 back in 2011. Here's a quick clip from today's podcast and the exclusive interview with Mrs. Ford. This was done well before the opening of the Betty Ford Center at Eisenhower Hospital. In this clip, Mrs. Ford talks about the intervention that saved her life.
I was not aware that the family would be arriving that morning. No way was I aware of it. And yet, once they came in and we all sat down, actually, in this room, the doctors were with them. Mm-hmm. And that had to give it away. I mean, I wasn't dumb. That, more or less, I knew that this was a very serious matter, because I can assure you nobody was smiling. I think that we're not fair if we don't intervene with people. It's a question of how you can do it successfully. And I think it's best done with, certainly, the aid of a professional person who understands intervention. And sometimes you have to wait for just the right opportunity to do it. Now, usually people will go for treatment if they're intervened in the right way, with love and understanding from their family. If the family does it in a caring way and a loving way and not a finger-pointing way, certainly it's going to, if it doesn't work, it's going to make them look pretty hard at what they're doing to themselves. And it plants that seed that is so important till maybe they don't get in treatment maybe for another year, but at least it plants the seed.
The full exclusive interview, free of interruption, is coming up in just a few minutes. I'm Neil Scott, host of Recovery Coast to Coast, and I want to begin by expressing my sincere thanks and deep gratitude to you for listening to this podcast. I realize your time's important, and there are many choices that you have, many podcasts that you could be listening to. I thank you for listening to ours. You know, following 15 years of nightly broadcasting on iHeartRadio in Seattle, our podcast features interviews with everyday people in recovery, as well as clinicians, authors, and recovering celebrities who offer the promise of hope and the reality of recovery, plus well-vetted resources for individuals, families, and friends. We invite you to enjoy the podcast, and it would help us out if you would share it with your friends as well. Again, recovery is an American way of life. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, we'd love to hear from you. Our email address is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Recovery Coast to Coast is supported by the good folks at Sundown M Ranch. Now, they're one of the oldest, least expensive, and most successful treatment programs in America. Treatment is as treatment does. You know, a question that I get quite a bit is, does treatment really work? Of course it does. If you are all in, and if you follow the prescribed treatment plan. You see, at Sundown, each individual patient is treated as an individual patient. Treatment is not one size fits all. Each patient is given a recovery toolkit, a prescription, if you will, a roadmap for long-term recovery. You know, if you got heart disease, you're given a post-hospital plan that helps you stay healthy and live a long life. Same for diabetes. Even if you have cancer, there's a treatment plan to follow, especially regarding nutrition and lifestyle choices. Is addiction any different? Not really. It is a disease from which people can and do recover. You leave the treatment center and you have the tools necessary for a successful recovery, a long-term recovery. However, it's up to you how you use them, how to manage your recovery. Sundown works with the patient and the family. This is vital to long-term recovery. And it's all part of the discharge plan. And, you know, if you don't follow the plan, the chances for a full recovery diminish significantly. Sundown does not treat and release. Sundown helps the patient in their continuing care program, helping them to transition back into the community. And their alumni program at Sundown is second to none. Treatment is all-inclusive. It's abstinence-based and 12-step centered. And since they are a not-for-profit organization, their rates are among the lowest in the country. They are not in it for the financial bottom line, but for the recovery of each and every patient. That's their bottom line. If you find yourself looking for a treatment center, definitely do your research. There's a lot of good ones out there, but definitely consider Sundown M Ranch, located on 30 acres at the mouth of the beautiful Yakima River Canyon. It's not far from Seattle. Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins. Sundown.org. Well, it's time for a big cup of coffee and a big look back at some history in the field of alcoholism and drug addiction. I was going over my archives recently, and I came across a rare interview that I did with former First Lady Betty Ford. It was back in the summer of 1982. Now, at that time, I was the editor of Alcoholism and Addiction Magazine. It was some 4 years following Mrs. Ford's public revelation that she was an alcoholic, and she was entering the addiction treatment program at Long Beach Naval Station under the auspices of Dr. Joe Persh. Now, this interview was recorded in the home of President and Mrs. Ford down in Rancho Mirage, California. It was not intended for a radio broadcast, but merely to use as background for the cover story article that I was writing. Thus, the quality of the recording is not the best, but it's pretty good. And the content is amazingly candid, honest, and insightful. During the 45-minute interview, which was done in her living room, her secretary Ann was present, and towards the end of the interview, even President Ford makes a cameo appearance. All in all, this interview, over 40 years old, is a hidden gem, recently unearthed, and I am delighted to share it with you. Let's listen to my conversation with Mrs. Betty Ford.
Your specific sobriety birthday is 1st or the 2nd of April or the 3rd?
Actually, I use April 7th because that was the date that I finished at midnight the last, capsule of medication to bring me down off the drugs that I had been, which were prescription drugs. I was highly medicated, as you know, for a pinched nerve in my neck and an arthritic condition. And I was using alcohol on top of that. So the combination was, of course, bombastic.
And this happened down here in the desert as opposed to in the White House?
I had been on the prescription drugs for about 15 years, but they had been increased considerably since we left Washington. When we left Washington and came out here, I think the adjustment of leaving our home there, which the place we had established more or less as home for the last 28 years, and it wasn't as if we left willingly. We were defeated for something that we were trying to win. I mean, this was the first time my husband had anything but success in running for office. So I think that probably leaving Washington, which had been our home for 28 years, was a big adjustment. Plus the fact that we left under circumstances. It wasn't as if we chose to say we had planned to retire, but we hadn't planned to retire that way.
Who has been the most significant person in your recovery?
I suppose, I hate to say, because my family have been so important, but then they've always been very important to me. And the individuals, there's so many individuals that have helped me. I think I've been a significant factor in my recovery. I think it takes all of the parts put together that makes recovery possible.
What was the hardest part of your early sobriety?
Depends on what you refer to as sobriety. If you mean by not drinking or not taking any mood-altering drugs, such as the medications I had been on, it would certainly be the medications because I was still in pain. But I was assured that if I would continue to learn to live without them, I would find my health a great deal better, and eventually a good deal of that pain would disappear. Dr. Persh told me this. I couldn't believe that could possibly be true. I'd been on medication for so long, it didn't seem possible. I'd always been a social drinker, and I had never seen any reason why, just because I had to take a few pills, I should not continue being the social drinker I had always been. It was definitely not giving up. I don't think it was giving up the drinking, although certainly that was part of my lifestyle. But because of the pain, I think it would have been the medication.
Are you uncomfortable at all now around alcohol? Certainly you're in social settings where there's alcohol.
Not at all. I'm very happy I don't have to be bothered with it. I am what you call a grateful alcoholic, which is a very strange terminology, but it's a very nice feeling to be able to live very comfortably with no embarrassment whatsoever. And when people offer you a drink or say, what would you like to drink, very comfortably say, well, I'll have a tonic and lime.
Do people feel comfortable talking to you about your recovery, social drinkers?
Very definitely, because I usually tend to be quite open and willing to bring it up and talk about it. I know that there are so many people out there that are just waiting for someone to bring it up because they have somebody perhaps in their family that has maybe gone through the same thing, or they wish would perhaps go through the same thing.
When did you know you were starting to get in trouble with the alcohol and drugs?
Well, I think when you pass over that invisible line, it's almost impossible to know you're in trouble. The disease itself is a disease of denial, and even if you feel that you have, I guess I knew because my family were beginning to make sure that the drinks that were given to me were not, they were light drinks. They were making an effort to make sure, because if we were going to have drinks before dinner, I know they made an effort to make them mild. I'd been on medication all day, and by the time I had a drink, I got very groggy and very zombie-ish in extreme cases. I mean...
What was your drinking pattern? In the afternoon, at the cocktail hour, at the end of the day?
Yes, because actually I was on medication all day from the time I got up in the morning. And when I learned about my disease, which was duo addiction, I learned from the doctors that I probably didn't need to drink during the day, because the mood-altering medications I was on were, in effect, practically the same thing as alcohol. I had the same effect.
Did Operation Understanding, which was held in Washington in 1976, when the 52 people came out and publicly acknowledged their alcoholism, Dick Van Dyke, former Congressman Mills, Buzz Aldrin, did this have an impact at all on you?
I was very impressed, and I thought it was wonderful. I was delighted, and I thought it was Harold Hughes, wasn't
Yes,
Senator
he was involved.
Hughes
Yes,
involved with that, and very supportive. I knew Congressman Mills very well. Everybody was very surprised that he was alcoholic, because he never drank at any of the parties, or he didn't really go to parties. To me, the hidden alcoholic or the invisible alcoholic is very hard to detect. And I think probably I was as much in that classification as some of the people like that. I never had to drink in for extended times or heavy amounts, because, and I keep going back to this duo addiction, which I'm sure you understand, some people don't.
Yes.
The synergistic quality of the interaction of drugs and alcohol. As Dr. Persh tells the story, it isn't a matter of 2 + 2 = 4, but 2 + 2 adds up to 22 when you're adding alcohol and drugs. I probably helped a lot of people get into treatment. This is not unusual for people who are alcoholic to, in the very beginning, even help others with their problem, and still, because of the denial of the disease, not see their own. I see this among people now who are still out there practicing, and they cannot see their own, but they're very willing to help someone else. It's not unusual for someone to say, well, my heavens, if I drank like that, I certainly would give it up. And yet the person themselves, everybody else is aware they have a problem too. I think I made sure I had lived a very structured life. I had come from a family that had set up certain mores as far as social activities were concerned. And so my drinking never interfered with my pattern of behavior in a way that would be offensive or noticeable. And I made sure that it didn't.
What were your childhood or adolescent attitudes towards drinking?
Oh, I wouldn't go out with boys in high school who I remember I went out with a boy once, and he drank beer at some party or dance, and I had him take me home, and I said, don't ever come this way again, because I did not want anything to do. That may have been a reaction from the fact that I was by that time aware that my father had died of alcoholism, which I didn't know until 16 when he did die of alcoholism. And I found out at the time of his death that he had been alcoholic. And my brother in high school was certainly very alcoholically inclined. I knew it caused a problem in our family. And to me it was a very improper thing to do. It still is.
What impact do you feel your public recovery has had? Are you able to measure that?
Oh, I never even think about that, because to me the importance is that I guess I'm selfish to know that my own recovery is such a wonderful thing, not only for me but for our family. I'm delighted when I hear that it's helped somebody else, and I was thrilled to death the other day when a woman came up to me and said that she had gone into recovery because of me, and she had read my book, and it had helped her recognize her own alcoholism. She was a lovely lady, young, really she was more of a young woman than a lady. She said when she went to her first AA meeting, she had my book in her arms. And that was how much it meant to her. She had read it several times. That is a very emotional thing to me. Yes, it moves me to sort of chills down my spine. I mean, I'm thrilled to death, and sort of tears well up a little bit in my eyes, because I know what it means to go through treatment, and I know how hard it is. No matter how you go into treatment, it's hard to face up to it. Mm-hmm. It's hard to know that you're not well. I guess it's not too much difference from maybe being told you have cancer and they hope they can do something for you, but they don't know. Mm-hmm. It's tough.
Are there special needs for a person in the public spotlight who goes through treatment?
They probably need a longer period to recover, because I think people who are in the spotlight, and usually through that focus of attention, have developed an image even within their own selves, and they build up a veneer that layer on layer protects them in that shell. They protect themselves. They have to protect themselves from the public. And then it's much harder to get through to their feelings when you try to go through recovery, mm-hmm. when they go through recovery.
Have you had any adverse reaction to your public acknowledgement to recovery?
Oh, yes. I even received telegrams to the effect, when I first announced it, that they thought it was very undignified, and particularly for a former First Lady to air her problems in public and that sort of thing. There were times that I momentarily thought, I guess I made a mistake. I never should have been so honest about a problem that our family is having. Because you see, with our family, it wasn't just me having the problem. We have been such a closely knit unit that if one of us has a problem, we all have a problem. And that's probably one of the greatest things that could happen toward my recovery. Not everybody has that support system. So I was just, so fortunate, and much more so than most people.
What role did Mr. Ford play as a spouse, and how about the rest of the family? Were they involved in a family program at Long Beach?
Yes, the family, with the exception of our oldest son and his wife, who were living on the East Coast, and they came for the intervention, but they had to go back east during the week, and then they returned the next weekend. But the rest of the family all participated in the program at Long Beach as family members.
Do you feel that's essential in a person's recovery?
I would think it was almost mandatory if it's possible. I'm sure there are some cases where physically it isn't possible, but in that case then I think a close friend or an employer or somebody in the family or close to the family should participate.
Are there special needs for a woman alcoholic?
As a woman, I feel that we have a very different set of values than men, and consequently we usually relate better to each other in treatment. Personally, I feel that women need each other in treatment as much perhaps as men need to interrelate with other men, because there's a certain understanding there about values that's different.
What advice could you give to a woman struggling with the disease?
I suppose it depends. I begin to think, who is this woman? Is she married? Does she have a family? Or is she working? Or is she running a house? And how's it affecting her? That's a very hard question when you just say a woman struggling with the disease. I guess I think probably the best recovery is found through the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that is certainly the most successful recovery program that a person can go to. And I would recommend that.
So your advice...
I'm trying to give an overall...
Sure.
Yeah.
Would be then to call someone in AA, which is certainly the most readily available resource.
Oh, yes. I mean, it's in your phone book in every city. They do call here a lot, and they're drinking. And Ann doesn't put them through to me. Now, if we get a call like that on a mastectomy, they put them through to me, but not if they're drinking. Because I get a lot of those.
Very wise. Sure. What are some of the bright spots of recovery for you over the last 4 years? I'm sure there have been many.
Well, the last 4 years has been probably the most interesting and fascinating that maybe I've had. It's certainly been the most different because I have been very independent. My role as mother and wife has not been the predominant role. I've had the opportunity to develop my own individual personality to a great extent, and being allowed to do that, and with the children all grown and in homes of their own, it has meant that I have sort of gone back into a career-oriented world where I am spending a great deal of time traveling, working, and trying to develop, for one thing, the Betty Ford Center at Eisenhower Hospital. But it has given me a whole new outlook on life. It's given me new energies, new health, new family relationships of greater depth and greater love, a greater spiritual program than I've ever had before.
Have you or do you intend on taking public positions on issues regarding alcoholism, such as labeling or mandatory insurance, those kinds of things?
I haven't come to a decision on those things. I want to be sure that I have the information from both sides of the issue. I think sometimes we can emotionally, because we feel so strongly about our lack of success tangling with alcohol, that we tend to jump at issues that maybe will, negate other people's use. And I'm not sure we should have that. I think it should be as it is with us. We have a choice whether we want to drink or not. Everybody should have that opportunity. I don't know exactly what issues you're speaking on. Certainly as far as drunk driving, I think that this has been very definitely a step in the right direction to save lives. I would like to see taxes higher on alcohol in California without a question. I think they're the lowest of any state in the union, and we need the tax money to run our government. Mm-hmm. But I don't like to blanketly say I'm... Mm-hmm. I have lobbied in Washington for more money.
You also were in
with
Texas.
No effect.
You were in Texas recently with the Texas Commission regarding insurance.
Yeah. Well, I guess, yes, I have, because I'm on that National Association of Insurance Commissioners Board, and I do believe that this is the right step. So I guess I said one thing and then turned around and...
Have you been approached to be more of a spokesperson for alcoholism, such as public service announcements or TV programs or these kinds of things?
How many do we have going? 3? 3, haven't we?
You certainly must get a lot of requests to do these kinds of things.
We're doing about 3 right now. We're in the process of doing one with that film with Joe Tecumini or with
FMS Productions.
Yeah,
right, for NCA.
Bob Fredericks. Mm-hmm. That one. We're doing the one with NCA for the ad campaign, and we're doing the benefit in Washington, but that's not a...
You must get a lot of requests to speak all over the country. How do you gracefully... Maybe that's a question for Anne.
Well, a man came up to me today, and he said, we sure would like to have you come speak to us in South... Well, it wasn't South... It was another one. And I said, well, I certainly would like to. And he said, but I guess we can't afford you. And I said, well, you must have heard from my secretary. And he said, well, no, but I know you're asking a fee. And I said, that's right, because I'm building this hospital. And I said, we're $1 million short until I get these things. That's the only way. And I said, I get it from corporations and big money people, not the small people, but from big people.
Talking a little bit about the Betty Ford Center, how will it be different from other treatment centers?
Well, I think that the whole idea of having a medium care bed rather than being in an acute care hospital type setting, it'll be less institutionalized. See, when you say from other treatment centers, I don't know which one you're referring to. I mean, if you're referring to, you're giving me an opportunity to talk about the Betty Ford Center. I'm trying to think of the things that are most important. It's going to be less institutionalized, and of course that chemical dependency recovery bed is a medium care bed, which is for ambulatory patients. They would have gone through a detox. One of the important things is it will be about a third the cost of most hospitalizations for treatment of alcoholism and drug abuse. The setting, I feel, is unique in the fact that it's in the desert, where people have to take that period to take a look at their life and perhaps readjusting to living a new lifestyle, and this gives them a perfect opportunity for being alone with themselves and perhaps finding a higher spirituality that will be helpful in their recovery.
How many beds will there be?
We're starting, of course, we're only starting off one patient building in the beginning, and then but we go to 60 beds to start out, and we can enlarge from there.
Will this be a co-ed facility?
Yes, it is co-ed. We do not have facilities at this point for the real young teenager, because we feel that they need a separate facility, and there are several of those around here.
To what extent will family therapy be a part of the treatment center?
The family therapy will be a week treatment, probably toward the middle or end of the patient's treatment.
Will this be 28 days?
We're adjusting to what people find is the most successful program. At first, it seemed as though family therapy should come the last week of the alcoholic patient's recovery. Now I have been looking into it with many family programs, and they think maybe the second or third week, so that the patient has an opportunity to stay on for a week and adjust after that week of family therapy.
Will this be 3 weeks or 4 weeks? 4-week program.
Well, a minimum, yeah.
And there will be no detox?
No, the detox will be done in the hospital. You see, we're right on the campus of Eisenhower Hospital. And if they come into emergency or need that sort of thing, we'll put them right in the hospital, and as soon as they're through detox, we'll move them to the Betty Ford Center. They're little golf carts or something that we can. And yet we can, that's one way that we can have it at 1/3 the cost of a hospital treatment, because we don't have all the costs of an emergency room and operating room and all acute care hospital.
Will aftercare be involved?
Very definitely. Aftercare is probably, I think treatment of the alcoholic patient is not complete without aftercare. I think you have, there's just certain parts to treatment for alcoholism. And I mean, if you start with your intervention, and then you go from intervention into your acute care, and from there you go into your intermediate care or intermediate bed care after the acute care, and you have family care, and finally your aftercare and follow-up is just as much a part of that whole program.
In your book, you said towards the end that you were still bitter towards the medical profession. Do you still share that feeling? No, because I've been trying to deal with the medical profession, many doctors who, they're oblivion to the disease of alcoholism because they are fine doctors, but they are focusing on something else. And I think because they have not had training in their med school, they don't feel they have to recognize it. We've got to bring the visibility up of treatment to such a level that they can no longer overlook it. And the public can help us do that by our alcohol awareness hours, which we started here, and I was not part of that startup, certainly, at Eisenhower. I think that has done as much as anything. Back to the intervention, you said there were actually 2 sessions. One was with Dr. Cruz, and then he came back with, as you described, reinforcements. How much time went by in between then, and did you have a chance to think about it? Were you expecting more?
No, I wasn't. I completely, Actually, I think, Dr. Cruz said I nodded off while he was telling me, sharing his story with me. I really was so medicated that I did. I was trying to do this house at that time. We were in the process. We had just moved into the house. I would say my family let me get the house done and then sent me off for treatment. They waited until we got a place to live and said, okay, now we'll send her away. No, I was working on the house, and I'm sure that adjustment of coming from Washington and the pressures of trying to build a house from scratch. We had our own plans and working on this and furnishing it and so forth was a very stressful time. And I know at stressful times I am generally in a lot more pain than I am other times, and I'm sure I was way over-medicating myself. And I imagine that's one of the reasons I went down almost. My disease became very progressive at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure, if you recall, there was something written about when I went over to Russia and did the narration for the ballet, and they referred to the slow, sleepy-eyed Betty Ford, and that was stress and pressure at a difficult time, and certainly the combination of alcohol and the medication that I was on. The medication had been stepped up, yes. I think that, I don't know what you asked me now. I think that
it was back to the intervention in terms of the time in between and how you dealt with that, the anger.
I was not aware that the family would be arriving that morning. No way was I aware of it. And yet, once they came in and we all sat down, actually, in this room, I knew that sort of they had come, well, the doctors were with them.
Mm-hmm.
And that had to give it away. I mean, I wasn't dumb. That more or less, I knew that they had medical men with them and that this was a very serious matter, because I can assure you nobody was smiling.
Did anyone in your family try to talk with you before this about the trouble that you were getting into? Mr. Ford, other members of the family?
You could say not directly. As I said earlier, I was aware of the fact that they were trying to say, with all those pills and everything, Mom, you shouldn't have so much to drink.
Mm-hmm.
But it meant, and I had a certain amount of feeling that, well, I've always had a drink, and before dinner, and there was a certain resentment that my drink was not as strong as somebody else's drink.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a feeling that they were making a difference in the fact that I wasn't able to. And due to that, I was aware, yes.
How do you feel about intervention now?
But I never thought I needed treatment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was like any normal alcoholic. Everybody else was at fault, not... I think intervention is absolutely marvelous. And I think it's the most life-saving thing there is. I think to be able to intervene or to have a confrontation with somebody in the middle of their progression in alcoholism before they get to the point where they are destroying, disabling their functions, not disabling, but I mean getting to the point where they're not functioning well is wonderful. And this is when people should come into treatment to learn how to cope with it. They don't have all the complications of the physical disabilities that can develop. I see people in places that I go who are, I don't know what you call it, where their legs, I mean, they're laid up with an some sort of an alcoholism that's caused their walking to be impaired for the rest of their life. And I think that we're not fair if we don't intervene with people. It's a question of how you can do it successfully. And I think it's best done with certainly the aid of a professional person who understands intervention. And sometimes you have to wait for just the right opportunity to do it. It is, it's not always, and people often, not too often though, usually people will go for treatment if they're intervened in the right way with love and understanding from their family. If the family does it in a caring way and a loving way and not a finger-pointing way, I think that most people, and certainly it's going to, if it doesn't work, it's going to make them look pretty hard at what they're doing to themselves. And it plants that seed that is so important till maybe they don't get in treatment maybe for another year, but at least it plants the seed.
Are you actively involved in helping people find sobriety?
Yes, very much so.
I know in the book you mentioned some interventions that you were involved in working on.
They've been fairly successful.
So you do continue to reach out?
Oh, yes. I usually have several people that I'm in the process of working with somebody else with. Okay. Generally speaking, I involve someone else besides myself. I don't try and attempt it all. By that, I don't mean a professional, but somebody. I sometimes am doing it long distance, and so I have to involve. Come on in, then.
Hi. Hello.
Hi, Mr. Ford. How are you? Pleased to meet you, sir.
Thank you. I'm going to leave.
He helps, too. He's my big right hand.
We're talking about.
In intervention.
I'm going to take a swim before I leave. Will you be, can I see you for a few minutes?
We're just wrapping up now.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take a swim.
Would you say that denial is the biggest barrier to treatment?
To me, as far as I'm concerned, I think denial is one of the strongest symptoms of the disease. And I think sometimes you can spot the alcoholic just through that denial. I mean, it's the way they brag about the fact that they couldn't possibly have a problem.
And the last question, similar to one I mentioned earlier, if you could give a message to family members with someone in their family who is struggling with their alcoholism, what would that message be to a family?
Well, I would want them to know that they are not alone in this struggle, and that if they would go to seek help with somebody else who's also having the same problem, like to attend Al-Anon and find out how to cope with it, that this would be probably the best help they could find.
You're a remarkable woman, and I thank you for taking time to share your story.
Well, I hope you have enjoyed my conversation with former First Lady Betty Ford, who changed the face of recovery and treatment in America. As I mentioned earlier, the Betty Ford Center merged with what I call the granddaddy of treatment programs, Hazelden, back in 2014. You can find out more about all of this at hazeldenbettyford.org. By the way, I want to remind listeners of this podcast that if you would like to tell your story of recovery, regardless of the path that you've chosen, as long as you have been in continuous recovery for at least a year or more, drop us a note, recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Actress Ali McGraw will speak up about affirming honesty. We'll hear from Ali McGraw in just 30 seconds.
She has always been your baby, but when your daughter got into drugs and alcohol, she turned into a stranger. What do you do? Where do you turn? Contact Sundown M Ranch. Sundown's nationally recognized youth treatment program guides young people back to a life free of drugs and alcohol. All treatment is gender-specific and directed by caring certified professionals in a safe environment. You can get your daughter back and get to know her again. Go to www.sundown.org to learn more.
And now, as promised, here is actress Ali McGraw on affirming honesty.
I affirm the inestimable value of honesty in my life today. When I am temporarily blown off course by unexpected events or seeming adversity, an honest appraisal of the situation can keep me anchored in reality. So long as I am honest with myself, with others, and with God, I can weather any storm. Through honest self-evaluation, I am learning a great deal about myself. The deeper I dig and the more truths I unearth, the better equipped I am to accept and initiate change. My dedication to truth enhances my self-esteem. What a relief it is to put aside the masks and camouflage of yesterday and be the real me. How good it makes me feel when I am able to talk openly and honestly about my fears and foibles, when I can share a secret or admit a mistake. Honesty in its various dimensions has done much to improve my relationships with family, friends, and co-workers. I once felt it was too complicated to tell the truth, and of course the exact opposite is the case. Life is so much simpler now that everyone knows where I stand and what I'm about. Thought for today. If at times it seems difficult to know God's will, I can be certain that complete honesty is a step in the right direction.
Well, that wraps up this edition of the national podcast, Recovery Coast to Coast. If you've enjoyed our podcast, please share it with others. You can do that via social media or simply by telling someone about it. You can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, our email is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. And please hit the subscribe or follow button. It's free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. And remember, if you know or love someone who's experiencing problems with alcohol or any other drug, here is a 24-hour national helpline that offers free information and confidential treatment referrals. Spanish-speaking individuals are available as well. 1-800-622-HELP. And join us next time for America's Voice for Recovery, Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. And another shout out to our sponsoring organization, Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins, sundown.org. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy, live in gratitude, and be kind to others. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.